Milwaukee family that knew what permissive meant before anybody ever heard the word. A dozen adults in the family and only 2 children, my younger brother Bob and myself, so of course there was no one who could make a no to us youngsters, me, no. Well, if one grown-up said we weren't to walk the fence top overlooking Mother's Rambler roses, we could always find another to encourage us and teach us a better system of fence walking. And this was fine, except that when I reached the normal age for rebellion, it was a genuine problem to pick anything against which to rebel. Now, my mother had a general's taste for problem solving, and she never sensed any incongruity between her mannerism and her advice. She was usually right, of course, that most of the world's ills stemmed from too little love. My dad had often taken me along on his calls at building construction projects. He'd tell me to follow him as he walked across the high boards and roof beams, and I was always frightened, but I never could bring myself to admit it, so I just did as he told me. And I thought he would never notice until one day he said, "You won't fall, I promise, if you don't look down. Just look ahead." Dickie Chappelle was an unsung American hero. As one of the first women to photograph and report from the front lines, her fearless determination to get the perfect shot blazed the trail for women in every area of journalism. She documented stunning victories, heartwarming relief efforts, and devastating losses. But as she distantly viewed the struggles of the world through the lens of a camera, her own struggles became too real to avoid with a flashbulb and a typewriter. But through her extreme dedication to her work, Dickie shows us that by pursuing our passions, we can learn to give grief a new name. Inspiration. What's a Woman Doing Here? By Dickie Chappelle. Tony Chappelle directed the making of TWA's publicity pictures. He had been one of the first Navy photographers in World War I, and that made him at least 40. But he had the most cheerful disposition of anyone I had ever known. Except, of course, when he was initiating tyros into the one matter on earth he held utterly sacred. Photography. I was awestruck by Tony. I learned my lessons bone deep as quickly as I could, and I don't think I've ever forgotten any one of them. You see, if you were a real photographer, you kept your equipment ready to shoot. If you were a real photographer, you were on the spot where things happened beforehand. You practiced judging the intensity of light until your fingers automatically went to the aperture and shutter controls of your camera. You practiced guessing speed until you unthinkingly rolled your focusing knob. In short, you became a picture-making machine and could dedicate all your conscious effort to deciding what was worth recording on film. And if a picture was a failure, no alibi would placate Tony. If your equipment failed, it was because you hadn't taken proper care of it. If you weren't in the right position to shoot, it was because you were too lazy to have climbed up where you should have been. And if your nerve failed. But then, I've been a photographer for 10 years before I'd ever heard one admit he'd been too shaken to shoot. No alibi. Just look ahead. When my course in picture taking did not end the first time I produced an acceptable photo. In October of 1940, the teacher and I went out to Milwaukee and we were married. And our first home was a hotel suite with a kitchenette big enough to serve as our joint dog room. You see, by now I was a dedicated photographer, and my career would be telling stories through pictures alone. And for 6 years, Tony and I served as a photographing and reporting team for a dozen humanitarian agencies. You see, we all wanted to remind people what havoc the war left, what terrible problems remained. But the workday pictures we'd been creating in New York seemed often to further the global illusion of peace. The post-war time overseas, I remember now as a kaleidoscope of people. Unfading, the way they looked and sounded vivid as yesterday. The wreckage resulting from man's inhumanity to man was the litany I wrote in the subject I photographed. And the magnitude of relief devised, it never quite matched the magnitude of suffering caused. Well, Tony's and my work as a photo team did end. And soon after we came to what I guess is called the parting of the ways, both personally and professionally. We were separated in 1955, and our marriage dissolved the following summer. And you know, several times interviewers have asked me the same question about marriage. They say, can a woman be both a foreign correspondent and a wife? Well, my answer is never at the same time. And you know, I just can't make the reason sound sentimental, although I'm sure it has to do with the heart and not the head. It's a 24-hour day task till the story's done. And once you start, you can't know where it will lead you. Until it's done, people you love always receive less evidence of love than the correspondent wants to give them. My mother's formula that human problems are solved by loving more and in no other way is, I'm sure, the correct one. Some marriages survive this deprivation indefinitely. Mine did not. In 1954, my father had passed away. The onset of my mother's fatal illness came when I was on my way home from California. She moved to New York for treatment, but neither us nor the doctor could help her anymore. I'd been a photographer for 10 years before I'd ever heard one admit he'd been too shaken to shoot. Because you see, the thing about photography is there is no alibi. If your equipment fails, no alibi. If your nerve fails, no alibi. If you aren't in the right position to shoot, no alibi. If your picture is a failure, no alibi. If your marriage... Tony taught us how to use the heavy-speed graphic, the camera newspaper, and then still carry in the movies. It's so big that snap shooting and taking a picture casually can't be done with it. You have to plan the picture in your mind's eye and move to the vantage point before you raise to the camera. See this was the most important lesson Tony wanted us to learn. Just look.